Welcome to Micro-Digressions. This is Spencer Case. I'm here today with a longtime podcasting partner, Mark Oppenheimer. This is the first time I've got Mark on solo. So I want to talk to you, Mark, about some stuff that you do when you're not podcasting. You know, that side gig you have, the whole lawyer thing. I understand that you've done a lot of work on like hate speech trials in South Africa, even arguing cases in front of the counterpart of the Supreme Court over there. And so I wanted to delve into some of these issues and, sort of set the background with some of the political context there. So I guess I'll ask you, what is some important political context, do you think, for understanding some of these cases?
Sure. So I suppose there's the background context, which is that during apartheid, South Africa was quite a repressive place with high levels of authoritarian censorship. So it used to be the case that radio stations would have, LPs with various tracks like scratched out. There was a list of banned books, including the book Black Beauty about a horse. So we grew up under this very censorial regime. If you had an image of the African National Congress of their party logo, that was a crime and you could be prosecuted for it. And so, after the fall of apartheid and with the new dispensation, we had this quite world celebrated constitution. So much so that Ruth Bader Ginsburg said to the Egyptians, if you want to model your new constitution on other countries, rather pick South Africa's than America's. And one of the virtues of the constitution is that it's very clearly written. And so we have quite a strong free speech right in South Africa. The constitution applies to everybody, not just citizens, but everyone inside of its borders. And it specifically says that the right is expansive and includes the right to artistic creativity. So like the process of making the art and the art itself, academic freedom. So it's specifically listed. And then the right to receive and impart ideas. And then there's a limitation. So the idea is that the right does not extend to the following three things, which is propaganda for war, the incitement of imminent violence, and the hate speech clause, which is advocacy of hatred on the grounds of race, gender, ethnicity, and religion, and that constitutes an incitement to cause harm. So just to kind of unpack what that framework means a little bit more. So first of all, these are not direct prohibitions. It just says that they're not part of the right, which means that the government has the power to produce laws which would create sanctions on these unprotected categories. We also have a sort of general limitations clause. So if it's basically reasonable inside an open and democratic country to restrict rights further, and it's rational to do so, then you can. So if you think about the limitations in the clause, the one is war being this very high level of harm. The second being incitement of imminent violence. So this violence, which would be like the destruction of property or, inflicting harm on human bodies, killing people, torturing them, that kind of thing. And that it must happen now, that imminent bit. And then the hate speech clause waters down two of those clauses. So one, it must be harm, not violence. And two, that it's not imminent. So, it could be that the harm will eventuate at some juncture. So that's the kind of landscape we find ourselves in. It's interesting as well that those particular categories are mentioned. So in our equality clause in the Constitution, we mention many more categories besides race, gender, ethnicity, and religion. And we have about 16, and we include sexual orientation and language and other things like that. The law that ultimately came out is kind of an odd law in that it's not a criminal statute. So it's called the Equality Act, and it allows either the state, often I think called the Human Rights Commission, which is a special state institution, it's meant to be the kind of watchdog of a lot of rights, or private parties to lay complaints against each other. And so your kind of sanctions for it would be making an apology, paying reparations, paying an amount of money to an organization that combats racial hatred, those sorts of things. So that's a kind of background, at least on the legal basis. The other kinds of backgrounds that are worth taking into account maybe depend on the particular case. So the case I'm probably the most well known for in South Africa and abroad is this case against Julius Malema, who's the leader of the Economic Freedom Fighters, which self-describes as a militant, radical, Marxist-Leninist, black nationalist political party. And at the time that we ran the case against them, it was the third biggest party in the country. And before our national elections a year ago, there was a reasonable prospect that he could have come in as a coalition partner with the African National Congress and been made deputy president or, a very high-ranking minister. Ultimately, what happened was that the ANC had a deal with the sort of centrist party, the Democratic Alliance, and the EFF are not part of the government but are in the opposition. So the EFF been sort of singing this song, which is shoot to kill a man, kill the farmer, kill the Boer. Boer is sort of understood generally in South Africa to refer to people who are Afrikaans or of Afrikaner descent. So people who are Dutch or French or German who settled in the 1600s and the 1800s, generally understood as Afrikaners. When I asked Mr. Malema, when you say farmer, who you're referring to, he said, I'm thinking of a white person. So quite clearly sort of racially driven. He also testified that the song is an instruction to soldiers to go out and to kill. He said that when the time is right, they will bomb the Union buildings, being the buildings where the president is based, so like the White House. He said that, in a revolution, violence is a necessary mechanism, and the revolution is now. So that's sort of the context for the song. But it also happens under a backdrop of real world violence. So a lot of Afrikaans people who work on farms find themselves subject to these extreme acts of violence. To kind of give you a sense of context, I always think it's hard to know how bad is a problem, if I just give you a number. And so you kind of want to be able to compare the number to other things. And the one is the raw number and the other one is a ratio. Over the last 30 years, we've had roughly 3,000 people who were murdered on farms. And often those acts of murder involve extreme acts of torture. So people would have molten plastic poured on them. They would have knives shoved down their throats. They would have boiling water on them. There's a terrible case of a mother and a daughter who had broken bottles used to cut their breasts off. And it was unclear whether they'd also been raped because of the use of the bottles was so extreme, and then killed the Boer was written in blood over their bodies. So that 3,000 figure, one way in which people try and say, well, it's not a big deal, is they compare it to how many people get murdered in South Africa every year. And South Africa has quite a high murder rate, about 35 out of 100,000. I think roughly 21,000 people a year get murdered. Now, a couple of ways to sort of put that in context then is, well, under what conditions are people murdered? So only about 5 out of 100,000 are from intruder attacks, and farm murders are all by definition intruder attacks. So an outsider comes onto the property, invades the residence, and then performs the act of killing. Whereas the other 30 out of 35 are things like social fabric crimes, gangsterism, rival gangs killing each other, domestic violence, people getting in drunken brawls. A couple of other numbers to sort of look at by comparison. During the Intifada in Israel, when you had this extreme acts of terrorism perpetrated by Palestinians against Israelis, you had about 750 people who were killed. In the Troubles in Ireland, which went on for decades, you had about 1,500 people killed. The farming group is a very small group. On some estimates, the number of commercial farmers is only about 35,000. If you sort of extended it to broader, let's say the family of the farmers and people living on farms, probably get to about 250,000. So you're dealing with quite a large percentage. The farmer murder rate, which is if you just look at the commercial farmers, is about 100 out of 100,000. And so if you compare that to the intruder attack rate, it's 20 times. So there's a serious problem with it. One way in which people sort of try and reject the problem is they set up a straw man. So they'll say there are allegations that there's a white genocide in South Africa. And there is no white genocide, therefore we shouldn't talk about farm murders. And there's no credible group that says there's a white genocide in South Africa. There isn't. But there is a serious problem with people being killed on the grounds of their race in these really torturous ways. And so part of why we ran this case was to draw attention to the problem. It's a problem that's sort of generally suppressed by the press in South Africa and abroad. So the BBC, whenever they report on South Africa's relationship with America, will say, Donald Trump has instituted a 30% tariff on South Africa based on false allegations of a white genocide. So, they'll sort of make that kind of move without saying, well, actually, there's a serious problem with people being killed on the grounds of their race. It's not the only problem as well. I mean, we have, during apartheid, we had these very strict race-based laws. So they determined where people could live, who they could marry, where they could work. And some of those laws have been removed and some new laws have been put in their place. So we have very strict race-based affirmative action policies, which make it basically impossible for minority groups in South Africa to be employed by the state. So whether you're white from India or from Malaysia, which are other population groups, there's a sort of strict demographic representativity cap. So you've got this genuinely systemic racism against minority groups because it's encoded in law. And that's not just employment by the state, but it's pushed to any private business that does work with the state. And there's been moves to try and elevate it beyond that. It goes into university admissions, into positions in the legal profession if you want to apply for training to become a lawyer. So we have this. There was a particular inciting incident in the Kill the Boer case as well, which was a young farmer called Brendan Horner, who was murdered when he was 21, and his body was put on display. And a group of people were caught on the assumption that they'd committed the crime. And at the arraignment proceedings, the local community gathered to protest farm murders. And the EFF arrived as well. And at that proceeding, they sang "Kill the Boer, Kill the Farmer," which was particularly inflammatory. Also sang another song which translates to "Burn these Boers." And a few days later, a number of farms were set alight in the area. So that was the sort of backdrop for that case.
Economic freedom fighters, that sounds to me like some Republican group like the Tea Party in the US that supports low taxes or something. I would not have associated that with Marxism, Leninism at all. Was that deliberately deceptive?
It's very funny. So there's an organization that's a libertarian organization in South Africa called the Free Market Foundation. Yeah, the economic freedom fighters, have a very different tool for fighting for economic freedom, which is to enslave everybody under a tyrannical communist state. One of the things that Mr. Malemba admitted at cross-examination was no one should have property rights, whether you're black or white. Everything must be owned by the state. And then as the vanguard, as the leadership, we will, of course, be the custodians of all this property, and we will determine whether you get to live here or not through some kind of leasehold. And they really, will give it to them. They are students of history. They spend a lot of time reading about Leninism and looking to the Soviet Union. And, as much as it, immiserated many Soviets' lives, it was probably pretty good if you were in the vanguard. You got to live it up. You got a whole host of wonderful free things while the citizens starved to death or were sent to gulags and murdered. So yeah, the economic freedom fighters are very good students of history. I don't think many of their followers are. A lot of them, I don't think, realize how detrimental to their own interests it would be to have a policy like that.
Thinking about the murder statistics that you just gave me, I believe 21,000 is a higher than average murder year for the United States, right? The total number of murders. I think we were above 21,000 with this recent, like the George Floyd summer crime spike. I think it got up there, but it hasn't been that high since like the early 90s. Whereas 21,000 for a country the size of South Africa, like what percentage of the population is South Africa? The US has got like 350 million people or something like that. How many are in South Africa?
Yeah, so we're roughly a sixth of that size. We're about 60 million. So, it's very worrying then if, basically the number of people who get killed is close to the same in the two countries when we're a sixth of the size. So it means our murder rate is sort of roughly 6 times. So yeah, that's a worry. One of the interesting things that happened at the White House when President Ramaphosa, the president of South Africa, went on a visit a couple of months ago, during the discussions, President Trump showed some footage of Mr. Malema singing this Kill the Boer song at these mass rallies, like 90,000 people stadiums. And, some of the people who were there testified about, what it's like living on a farm. And, they said that, it's pretty dangerous and that, some of their relatives had been attacked and killed and, or had survived attacks, but their farm workers had been killed. And one of the other government spokesperson, this was people that were brought by South Africa. You're supposed to tell a good news story, who fessed up to some of the terrible things going on. And someone else said, well, look, it's not only the white farmers who are being killed. We kill grandmothers as well. And, poor black children get killed. Please come visit. So, yeah, there's a sort of strange doublespeak that happens in South Africa where they say, yeah, you whites are being slaughtered. But, we shouldn't really talk about it because other people are also being killed. So shut up. And, one way to do it is to say, well, we should try and reduce the murder rate generally. And if there are things that we can do to prevent, people being tortured on farms, we should really take those measures. And one of those measures is to try and de-escalate the sort of rhetoric, not make it feel like these are people who can be freely targeted because they're not real human beings. A lot of the rhetoric sort of is that these people are land thieves, they're invaders, they're criminals. If someone stole your land because they're colonized, 400 years ago, then you must punish them because that's what thieves are deserving of, this sort of stuff.
One thing that's kind of curious to me, and I think this probably gets us more into South African history, is why are we talking about like farmers as a category of violence, as opposed to all other home invasions, as opposed to all other kind of murders? Why carve it up in that way?
Yeah, it's sort of, I suppose there's a historical reason for it. Partly, it's a community that up until 1990 didn't really suffer much violence at all. There was a targeted campaign waged against farmers by the African National Congress. They thought it would be a good way to build up weapons caches, to rob and to kill to fund the revolution. So you had a lot of that. Mines were planted, like landmines were planted on the farmers' farms, which often had the terrible effect of killing the farm laborers, who are often black and often children. So you really did have genuine acts of terror perpetrated by the African National Congress at the time. And then also, we have quite an impressive agricultural sector in South Africa. We export a lot of like amazing things. Our wine sector, for example, is like world class. A lot of amazing fruits, things like that. So it's economically important. And as a group, the nature of farms is that they're very broad. So it's a huge piece of land. They used to have a thing called the commando system where the farmers would be able to police their own territory and coordinate with each other. And then that got banned by the state. So the request has always been to say, we need to make it a priority crime, not in the sense that it's the most important crime, but it sort of means that you need to have a special method for dealing with it. So we have other kinds of special crimes in South Africa, like one is copper cable theft. So people will go and dig up electricity cables and telephone cables and sell the copper. And that causes an enormous amount of economic damage and is a really dangerous thing to do as well. So often you see people who are missing hands or arms in South Africa because they steal in copper cables and got electrocuted. So it's one of those things where you need a special solution to the problem. We also have a very large proportion of the world's rhinos in South Africa, and rhinoceroses. So, and there's a problem with poaching. And so there's special units that protect the rhinos. And there's a special way of dealing with that to prevent the poachers from killing the rhinos. So the idea is you should, have some similar kind of task force. The farmer thing is they are targeted qua farmer, but they're also targeted in relation to their ethnicity. There are other Afrikaans people are generally denigrated and sort of treated as if they were the masterminds behind apartheid and that the group should be liable for the sins of their fathers, this sort of stuff. And then some of that, South Africa's got many different ethnic groups. People who are, let's say, classified by the state as white are generally going to fall into English and Afrikaans. I'm neither. My grandparents came from Germany and other side from Lithuania, but I'm English speaking. Some of that sort of anti-Afrikaner sentiment blows back into other groups. So it's not just Afrikaners who are liable for the sins of their fathers, it's all white people.
So there are a number of ways in which I realize when I think about South Africa, I just sort of project my American reference points sort of onto South Africa in a way that I think is helpful in some ways, but also probably distorting. So it overlooks the differences between the different groups of whites and the different groups of blacks and the colors, which are kind of their own category. The mixed race people, I think they call them the colors there, if I'm not mistaken. But then so for example, I tend to think of apartheid as sort of like your Jim Crow, and the fall of apartheid is like your civil rights movement. And then Nelson Mandela is sort of like a mashup between Abraham Lincoln, who refounded the republic, and George Washington, who gave up power instead of staying on and becoming president for life, and Martin Luther King, who sort of is the leading figure heralding the civil rights movement. And so I have this kind of a mashup of different American reference points in my mind, but I know that that's not exactly accurate. It's smoothing out all these group differences, and the timeline is not quite the same. So could you maybe elaborate on that?
Yeah, sure. So Mandela is generally quite well regarded in South Africa still by most people. There are different kinds of critiques. So some people feel that Mandela sold out black people because he was too conciliatory in the 90s. There was this big movement towards reconciliation and forgiveness and trying to build a new state. And so you have radical groups like the EFF, who will either say Mandela was a sellout or say we've misunderstood Mandela. Mandela, was actually a violent revolutionary, who carried around a gun, and, was engaged in, violent resistance against the state. And that's what we need to emulate, not the old guy who came out of Robben Island who wanted to give everyone a hug and sort of, build peaceful prosperity. I mean, one of the things Mr. Malema said in testimony trial was, Mandela asked us to reconcile with the whites, but we can't reconcile with them because we were never their friends. So the reconciliation implies that you had a relationship to start with. And so there's this real sense of you are invaders who don't belong here. An inconvenient bit of history for that line is that, South Africa really has had many different people come to its shores over a long period of time. You had the Dutch settling in 1652, and so the Afrikaners draw some of their heritage from that. You had the English coming in the 18th, but you also had many black tribes from the rest of Africa coming after the Dutch settled, so in the 1700s. And you had the San Bushmen, in various parts of South Africa who were chased out by some of these other tribes. And then you had lots of inter-ethnic conflict. Like black is a very weird word in South Africa because you've got, Zulu people, Xhosa people, Tswana people, Sotho people. Some of those groups get on with each other, others hate each other. You had a lot of violence in South Africa during the transition period into democracy between the ANC and the Inkatha Freedom Party. So broadly Zulu people and Xhosa people, and quite violent bloodshed. You also had other kinds of like inter hostilities with people being something called necklacing, where you take a tire and you put it around someone's neck and you fill it with gasoline and you set it alight. And that was generally done by members of the ANC against other black people in townships on the basis that they were collaborating either with the Inkatha Freedom Party or with the National Party or under suspicion of this. And so during the Truth and Reconciliation Commission process, you had some of this stuff coming out. Yeah, so one way to think about Mandela as a sort of father of the nation figure, where you've got this new democracy that's brought out. Non-racialism is entrenched into our constitution, so colorblindness. It would be nice if we actually abided by that. We don't. We'll become more and more re-racialized over time and have all these race-based laws that are highly discriminatory and put us back. But yeah, there are these different sides, I suppose, to think about Mandela. And there are some of the seeds for the current problems of South Africa were planted by Mandela in his presidency. But you had a euphoria at the time. So, South Africa had sort of been, a skunk on the national stage, had been isolated and boycotted. So, once we had the new democratic elections in 94, there was a sense of internal jubilation and external. We then were involved in these quite like big events. So we hosted the Rugby World Cup in 95, which we won. South Africans still very proud about that. Sport was kind of seen as a moment of racial reconciliation. So, the rugby team, which had been viewed as was a whites only team, had black players on it. Mandela came onto the field and held up the cup. You had people waving the new South African flag, at these rallies. So you had this new emblem of the country. So a lot of people kind of coming under one banner. Then next president, Thabo Mbeki, introduced a lot of these race-based laws, but their sort of sting only really hit later. And we had a big period of economic prosperity under his reign. We then had a president called Jacob Zuma, who was indicted in a state capture project where enormous amounts of money were looted from the state and all sorts of like illicit deals were done with people. And that really caused an enormous amount of economic stagnation. And our latest president is Cyril Ramaphosa, who was thought to be a reformer when he first came in, but has really sort of doubled down on the socialism and the black nationalism.
So we're not that many presidents removed from Mandela then. I didn't realize that. I have heard this criticism from the right of Mandela, which is like, he supported necklacing in his earlier days and he was violent. And to me, that makes the reconciliationist Mandela all the more impressive. I don't see that as tarnishing him all that much. The other thing I've thought about this is, it seems to me, and you can tell me whether this is wrong or not, but one good thing that happened in the United States early on is that after John Adams, the parties switched over. George Washington had a successor, John Adams. Even though he eschewed parties, he had one. He didn't like to admit it, And then the Jeffersonians took over after Adams, and so we've had fairly regular switch between the parties ever since then. And it's not without its problems. Like there was a time in the mid 20th century where the two parties were too alike. There wasn't really much differentiating that. And now it seems like the parties are really far apart. So the pendulum swing is really wide. So that's got its own problems. But I still would prefer it over what you have in a lot of countries where one party with a charismatic founder just gets entrenched like forever. And it seems to have happened. I know that ANC is no longer as powerful as it was a few years ago, but they've had quite a lot of power for quite a long time, and there hasn't been the same kind of healthy turnover. Am I mistaken in that impression?
Yeah, so the ANC would famously say that they would rule until Jesus comes back. So there was an enormous amount of hubris. This was said by Jacob Zuma. The party really did have enormous amounts of support. So I think in the first election garnered about 60% of the vote. The National Party, being the prior party, about 20%. And then the rest sort of split between other smaller groups. Interesting, the National Party disintegrated quite soon after that election. A very small party called the Democratic Party, which was a sort of anti-apartheid party during apartheid, represented by Helen Suzman, who, really valiantly fought against apartheid and asked the National Party all sorts of difficult questions about what they were doing. That party now has about 22% support and is in government because the African National Congress are now at 40%. So they are unable to run a government on their own. Over the years, what happened as well is that in the cities, the ANC's support waned. And so the Democratic Alliance had at various times some of the bigger cities. One of the interesting features of South Africa is we have some multi-party democracy, but without thresholds, you could get into parliament with one seat, and we have 400 seats. So with 0.25% of the vote, which means that there are some like quite obnoxious parties that get in. There's like a party called Al Jamar that is it's an Islamist party. It really kind of campaigns on two things. Say there's sort of the destruction of Israel and bringing in Sharia law. And that party managed to have two mayors of Johannesburg, which is the city that I live in, and is the economic hub, not just of South Africa, but of the continent, despite only having 3 seats out of something like 240. So because the bigger parties couldn't do a deal, these guys sort of stood in and just looted the place, and then tried to rename one of our main streets, which is Santon Drive, where the American consulate is, to Leila Khaled Drive, Leila Khaled being the Palestinian terrorist hijacker. So these are their great achievements.
So yeah, it sounds like the commitment to the commitment to racial blindness is like something this is common between the U.S. and South Africa as well. It's like officially yes, but like unofficially, people find ways around that or just outright ignore it and implement whatever preferences they favor. And I've heard people point to this as evidence that say, well, to hell with racial blindness because nobody's going to do it. We really just can't transcend group racial politicking, which is a conclusion I don't want to accept. I think it's too pessimistic, and I think it lets off the hook the people who have corrupted the system because it makes it seem as if the outcome is inevitable when it's the product of choice. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, to my mind, you can have a race-blind country. There are many. And there's no need to have these sort of divisive laws. I think they're also the kinds of things that will be enormously abused. So the way that race-based law is sold in South Africa is to say, well, because of the wrongs of the past, we need to have these measures to sort of uplift people. The policy is called broad-based Black economic empowerment. How it works in practice is that only 100 families received R1 trillion. You can divide by about 20 to get into dollars. And many poor Black people who would be meant to enjoy the fruits of these sort of tenders that are handed out by the government. So if you have a social housing project, for example, you'll have this very small connected few who will get the government contract. They will distort the price because white businesses will be excluded from being able to tender. So you'll wind up with a thing that costs more and is less efficient for various reasons. And if you put your thumb on the scale anyway, if you said only people who've got blonde hair are allowed to, put in bids, well, that's going to, make it much harder to get a good price. So you want to let a lot of people put in a bid, let the best one, win, and then you can build your houses at the best price. It's tended to create enormous amounts of inequality within the group. So you wind up with a Black elite. There are more Black people in the middle class in South Africa than there are white people. I think the richest people in South Africa are all Black. And you have this very poor group of people as well who are Black. And there's a poor group of white people. There's about 300,000 white people who live in shanty towns. So because a lot of them have been locked out of the labor market because of the basis of their race. And then it generates all this hostility. Instead of, as I mentioned, this sort of time in South African history, we go, all right, let's like see each other as brothers and as part of this one new national project. You're now trained to regard each other with suspicion and hatred. And that's not a very useful thing, at least for the populace. Might be very useful for the political parties who sort of trade on the hatred, so they can stay in power and get access to all the fruits of handing out tenders, like the kickbacks.
And I imagine, I guess this will be my last question about politics, and then we'll move on to the matter at hand. I imagine that there's something really perverse about being able to always say, well, no matter how bad we are, well, we're the party that came after apartheid and we defeated apartheid. You don't want to go back to that, do you? You don't want to go back to apartheid. I imagine that is an incredibly powerful rhetorical weapon at the ANC's disposal.
Yeah, I think it has been for a while. I think what undercuts that line, and they really have said, well, if you vote for someone else, you're going back to apartheid. is now that you have the Democratic Alliance in government, and they also control one of the provinces in South Africa, the Western Cape, which is probably the most well visited by tourists. I mean, Cape Town is one of the most spectacular cities in the world, and it runs very well. It's hyper efficient. It's beautiful. It's kind of has a European feel to it in a lot of ways. It's hard to say, well, these guys have been in government and they're not instituting apartheid, and they actually fought against apartheid while they were in power before. So that sort of myth, I think is fading. The way a friend of mine put it, he runs an organization in South Africa called Lex Libertas, says the problem with South Africa is that since 1910, since union, you've really had like strong central governments that have imposed their will on the rest of the country. And, that includes the apartheid government, which, really was an authoritarian government, and includes the current government. And what you should rather have is some kind of decentralized authority that respects the fact that you've got all these different groups that live in South Africa with their own different languages and needs and, customs. And you try and find a way to sort of make that stuff work. And you give much more power to local communities and to provinces and things like that, to have more of a federalism. I mean, in the States, you on paper have a federal project, but there's a lot of complaint from the states that, the federal government is eroding their rights, and that certain choices are being taken away from them. And that, Americans really do have quite different views on how they want to be governed. And, governing it all centrally is a guaranteed way to upset at least half the people.
Right. That's another sort of familiar reference point, I guess, for those of the states. So I guess getting back to the hate speech now, it's interesting that there are two different categories that you mentioned, that there's an incitement exception to the right to free speech in the South African Constitution. And then there's also this hate speech category, which is also not protected. And I guess one thought would be, why not have just one category here? Hate speech just is a form of incitement. That seems credible. And I guess the worry is, if it's like, oh, because it doesn't have to be imminent and the harm doesn't have to be violence. I am just suspicious of this kind of category, because once you get emotional harm as counting as harm and stuff, um, this is an exception that could explode the whole principle of free speech. At least that's my worry.
Yeah, it's a good worry to have. So I'll tell you about another case that I was involved in. It's regarded as the locus classicus of free speech, hate speech in South African law. It relates to a journalist called John Quilani. So Quilani was a black journalist in South Africa, an anti-apartheid journalist, also quite a religious Christian. And in South Africa, we had a statute which only allowed for men to marry women, and there's a challenge brought on the basis that it was discriminatory on the grounds of sexual orientation. And our constitutional court basically said this matter must be referred to Parliament. They must have a discussion about it. And to live up to their constitutional obligations, they must provide a statute that would allow for, gay marriage or something analogous. And so for a period of about a year, you had a lot of vigorous debate about whether we should have gay marriage or not. You had various parliamentarians raising concerns about it. It's can you imagine all the sort of debates that we had in the States? And ultimately, we did have gay marriage, and this was put into law in about 2006. So Quilani wrote a critique of this. It was published in 2008. And one of the things he says in the article is, I pray that politicians would have the balls to change those parts of the Constitution that allow a man to marry a man and ditto a woman, because someday some idiot will demand the right to marry an animal. And a hate speech case was brought against him. He was held liable under the statute at the time of the Equality Act. And then I acted for him in the two appeal courts, which included the Constitutional Court. Now, a couple of things about the statute is that it looked quite different from what the Constitution said. So it didn't just reference incitement to harm. It talked about harm itself and also hurt. So hurt is exactly that kind of thing that you have in mind of an emotional harm. So I feel angry or sad. That's a very low threshold. And one way the courts had basically been reading these hate speech cases was to say, hurtful speech is hate speech, and therefore you can ban it. So that's a very low bar. And so we challenged the constitutionality of it. And we also challenged the constitutionality of the broad grounds. So we said, look, sexual orientation is not listed in the Constitution under the hate speech provision. And the founders knew about it as a category because it's in the anti-discrimination clauses. And so what they intended was that it would be at the higher threshold of incitement to imminent violence. So you can very welcome to pass a law at that threshold for that group. But the other four groups are there for a reason, which is that you had apartheid on the grounds of race. You've had, religious genocides against Jews. Maybe there's an argument for kind of systemic patriarchy, against on the grounds of sex. So there's a reason why those four groups are there. At the Supreme Court of Appeal, we were successful, and the statute was the sort of section of the statute was chucked out and replaced with the constitutional standard. It then went on further appeal, and the Constitutional Court one coda, the Supreme Court of Appeal said, look, sexual orientation isn't listed, but it does seem that gay people in South Africa find themselves in a very precarious position. We have a phenomenon called corrective rape. I realized when I was on my recent trip to the States that I had to explain what this means because it's such an odd term. But basically what it
Yeah,
is
it
that
sounds hideous. It sounds absolutely hideous. Before you've even explained it, it seems hideous.
yeah, it is. So corrective rape is the idea that if you rape a lesbian woman, you can correct her wrong sexual orientation so that she will become straight. And so this was quite a widespread phenomenon. And one of the things that came out in the original Kulani trial is you had people testifying to say, look, these sorts of articles, add to a climate where corrective rape is going on, and it sort of justifies that kind of behavior because our lifestyle choices are seen as the wrong kinds of choices. The term preference as well, sexual preference, became like a fight to be had in South Africa. It's like, is it okay to sort of a preference when maybe you're born that way? And that debate sort of rages on back and forth. So the court added in sexual orientation, and I think that's a justifiable limitation. The Constitutional Court did a sort of mixed thing. So they decided hurtful speech is not hate speech. And so they struck that out. But they retained two other features of the act. The one is to say you've got to have propagation of hatred, will include a whole bunch of groups. So they took the egalitarian path and added in a bunch of others. And it's either got to incite harm or it's got to be harmful. But they wanted to say harmful is different from hurtful. So harmful is sort of seen as like a very serious invasion of someone's dignity or a kind of lasting psychological harm that could be measured by a trained medical professional. So that was the sort of test that was encoded based on that case.
All right. Just to recap. So after the Supreme Court decided that, I guess I'm going to be using American language, that sexual orientation was a protected class with regard to the hate speech clause of the Constitution, would the person you defended, would remarks like his be considered hate speech after their ruling?
So interesting thing, the Supreme Court took the view that given that they had struck down the statute, that they could not find him liable for hate speech. The Constitutional Court took a different view, which they said, we've struck down a portion of the statute, but nonetheless, we think what you said amounts to hate speech, which is interesting. So, I told you about the Kill the Boer case, and I've told you about Kulani's case. So Kulani, what you really have is there's no attack on gay people at all. There's attack on the idea of gay marriage. And this is a discussion that was had by politicians, and he would have said very similar things. And the line he has about some idiot may demand the right to marry an animal, not totally nuts, given that we use the term sexual orientation, and an argument could be made that orientations are broad and they could well include things like a desire to be with animals, like a bestiophilia as an orientation. And he doesn't say the person would be able to get it, just that they may demand it. So the court basically says, we don't like it, so it's hate speech. With the Kill the Boer case, where you've got basically a situation where people are being murdered. You've got a backdrop of this thing not happening in a vacuum. It's clearly targeting a racial or ethnic group in an extreme way of violence, so they must be killed. And it's done by a very powerful politician. There the court said, no, it seems fine to us, not hate speech. So this is one of the problems.
Was Kulani prosecuted then, even though the statute under which he was brought to trial was overturned?
Yes, the Constitutional Court held that the original finding of hate speech would stand from the trial court, even though they had overturned a portion of the statute. And there was much discussion about retrospective application of laws and things like this. The line was, well, Kulani faced a heavier statute in its form. And so all we've done is make that statute less heavy because we've added more to the free speech protections. And so therefore he must be held liable under the new version of the statute. But the liability was only a declaration. Kulani had died at this juncture. I think had only been ordered to make an apology in the original case. And so there would have been no criminal sanctions for him. There was discussion about trying to make his family apologize on his behalf, which the court rejected, rightly so. What further complicates this sort of story is, so as I say, Kulani now sets the norm, does these adjustments around what the law could look like because of reasonable limitations. And then the state introduced a criminal version of the statute, which allows people to be incarcerated for 8 years. That tracks the sort of test in the Kulani case. And the worry with that is that, when you could only make an apology, or have to pay some fine, yeah, okay, fine, we limited your constitutional rights. That's kind of reasonable. When I got to put you in jail, then it seems like you should really stick to the letter of the law. in terms of the original constitutional caveats. And so that statute is a law, but hasn't been implemented yet. And so we have to see whether it'll survive constitutional muster. But then you also have this double standards problem where, basically, if you aiming at a group that are sort of seen as protected by the state, or you're part of a group protected by the state, well, then your speech will be allowed. But if not, well, then tough.
So, one curious thing here is just this general idea that hate speech is hatred of certain categories of person, right? Like, it couldn't be nothing I say about Mark Oppenheimer as an individual, no matter how nasty, not that I would say them, would count as hate speech. Or if I hate a group of people, but it's an idiosyncratic group of people. Justin Bieber fans, I really, really hate Justin Bieber fans say. It seems like, and this doesn't seem to be particular in South Africa. This just seems how generally hate speech and hate crimes are understood. They're understood in terms of being directed towards categories. I find that kind of mysterious. I don't see why that should be.
Yeah, so you might think that one, for individuals, that they have other kinds of protections. So, for example, if you said Mark is a child killer, that my protection against you is not a hate speech law, but rather, defamation. Or in South Africa, we have a thing called crimen injuria, which is when you have a serious impairment of someone's dignity, which could be through the result of speech, that's prosecutable. And then there's these other groups, as you say. One move is really to kind of just say we should just include every possible group we can think of, which is sort of the South African approach. As I say, we have these plethora of different groups. Belief is one of the listed grounds, for example. And so belief could include all sorts of things. So, it could be, let's say, religious groups or philosophical groups. So arguably, you said all utilitarians should be tortured to death. There'd be an argument that that's a sort of belief that people have in that moral system, and therefore, worthy of hate speech protection. The other route to be restrictive is to say, well, there's some sort of historical reason why certain groups have suffered in serious ways, and why we should be more wary of speech that targets on that basis, because there's a history of, ethnic cleansing or genocides or racial discrimination, and that groups that don't have that history shouldn't be treated the same. The other route, as you say, is to just say, well, why reference the groups at all? Why not just have general, provisions which are worried about incitement, which is more in line with this, John Stuart Mill line, where, there he's dealing with a sort of corn dealer. And so there's an immediacy of the corn dealer being killed by the angry mob. He's not part of any particular group. And again, there's the worry with groups is that you can sort of see the double standard emerge. So, if there was a white politician that said, shoot to kill, shoot the blacks, I can guarantee you they'd be sitting in a jail cell right now, But, when you have a very powerful politician saying, kill the whites, well, they had it coming, so it's fine. So those sorts of things, start to rankle. But you could have the same with another general law where just there's differential enforcement. And so I do think, one of the dangers of hate speech laws is that they're still being implemented by individuals, and, they can be done in quite partisan ways. And just an example of this, Catherine McKinnon and Andrea Dworkin managed to lobby for anti-pornography laws in Canada, and specified all the kinds of things that would count as pornography, sort of depictions of women being subordinated and abused. And so the laws were implemented quite quickly. And the first things that were banned were books by Andrea Dworkin, because they had these accounts of women being raped in them. And so, often the speech restrictive laws, have an effect that you don't expect, and often are used against the sort of groups without power, so minority groups and vulnerable groups.
Another thought that occurred to me is you get this kind of weird consequence here, which is suppose you had some, pro otherkin furry sexual radical on the opposite end of the spectrum of Kwalani, I guess, who's like, yeah, we should expand marriage to include marriage with animals, marriage with multiple partners. Let her rip, baby. Let people do whatever they want to do. That would be making the same kind of move, at least the conditional move, but that, I presume, wouldn't be considered hate speech, even if people thought it was nutty.
Yeah, I suppose the argument with Kolani, which is a debatable one for a couple of technical reasons, was, well, he was calling for a restriction of rights as opposed to an expansion. And there's a debate as to whether changing a law which would take away people's vested rights would amount to a harm. In some contexts, in Kulani in particular, they basically said, yeah, calling for legal reform, there would be a harm. But in other cases where people said, we should abolish all property rights, especially the ones held by whites. And no, that's just a call for, a legal discussion here. Don't get your panties in a twist. People must be allowed to put out ideas on the legislative floor about what the law should look like. Why would you think that's discriminatory speech? Come on. So, and then also he uses the term "I wish," and traditionally in South African law, that was not seen as a sort of inciting thing. It was like an expression of a desire as opposed to a call to action. But all sorts of things can be ignored in the face of a just cause.
You don't have to convince me about the hypocrisy and double standards of these courts. I can well imagine it. You've told me about it. I'm just trying to think through the principle here, which is, seems like this is a general problem with hate speech, which is like, can't you just imagine someone else making a similar point in a non-hateful way, or with a different intent, or with a different attitude? And then would it not be hate speech? I guess what I'm trying to do here is to get down to what is the essential thing that's being criminalized here? Is it the propositional content, or is it the attitude with which it's said, or is it some false presupposition, or what is it?
Yeah, so we, at least in our statute, have a series of different levers that you need to hit. Funny enough, we don't say intentional. We say something much more obfuscatory, which is that something along the lines of, would a reasonable person, having heard the statement, assume that you had the intent to propagate hatred against the group? So it sounds a little weird. It's a little bit like a reasonable reader test. So because it's hard to pry into people's minds, we say, well, it doesn't matter whether you intended to do this thing or not. The fact is other people would divine that from your activity. And so, that's the one standard. In criminal law, you really shouldn't do stuff like that. Like we basically, our general standard is crimes must be done intentionally. And you can, of course, work out someone's intent, not just by opening up their brain, but by looking at their conduct. And then we have negligence as a crime in very few cases, but it's allowed civilly. So, if I, doctor and I botch your operation by using an improper standard for how I did it, you can sue me, but maybe you can't prosecute me for it. So thinking about the level of penalty, I think matters. You want specificity. So one of the things that worries me about the term hate speech is that it basically, if you don't define it, means speech that I hate, and that's in the eye of the beholder. And so I was, recently in the States and sort of giving a bit of a lecture tour and looked through some university speech codes. And so they'll just say stuff like, you're not allowed to engage in hate speech, but they don't tell you what it is. So that just gives all this power to a university administrator to say, we don't like what you said, that's hate speech, under conditions where American law doesn't recognize the category. So there's no like case law precedence on what hate speech is. You've got, social media giants who've got some idea of what hate speech is, but it's nebulous. At least in South Africa, for all the problems, there's an attempt to try and pin it down to say, well, it's got to have these features and must have all of them. There was a time when it was ambiguous whether it was any one of them. But you might think, for example, if you're following the general precepts of law, like, all right, well, there must be some mens rea element. So like, some kind of thought in your mind about what is going on here. There must be an act. So the speech act itself, it must be promoting hatred as one of the things in the world, and either harmful. Now I worry about the direct harm stuff, or incitement. So we can sort of look at it. All right, is this a call to action? And then you could have different things about, does it matter if the harm actually results? So, I call up the assassin and I say, shoot my wife, but the assassin had too many shots of whiskey that day and he misses. You might still want to punish me for it, even though it's an inchoate crime. It's like attempted murder. And so you could have some debate about whether the harm occurring matters or not, or whether it just goes to penalty, something like that.
Another thing about just the general category of hate speech, and I guess hate crimes too, is I feel like there's this bias towards directly connecting bad actions, morally bad actions, with transparently ugly motives. And also for thinking that things done from seemingly nice motives are virtuous for that reason, right? I've written a bit about this in my article on extremism. It's quite dangerous to think, well, my motives are pure, so my action must be good, or something like that. And I think that's kind of the other side of the coin, to thinking like a bad form of speech is hateful. It must be hateful. It must come from this ugly place. But like, wait, if there are categories of speech that are harmful, why assume that they need to come specifically from hatred or to promote hatred? Like, there are many other ways in which speech could potentially be harmful.
Yeah, so you might think there's an umbrella category of unprotected speech, and that includes things like defamation, which don't require hate. But under the umbrella is also hate speech, which does require hate. It doesn't, it's just a subcategory. And that seems sort of reasonable to me to think it's a special case. Same with, there's a big umbrella of crime, and there's a subcategory, which is hate crimes. I think generally the way the common law systems work is that we think mental states matter. I hit a child with my car. That's the act. I think it's worth inquiring whether I, deliberately killed the child in my car, intended on killing the child in my car, or whether I wasn't paying attention while I was driving and I accidentally killed the child. So if you just care about outcomes, you go, well, it doesn't matter what your thoughts were. But we think the thought matters a lot for whether it was a crime at all or whether, the amount of penalty we should have. And so you might think that motive plays some sort of role. Let's say it's a black child and I deliberately killed the child because it's a black child. That seems really pernicious and something that you might want to take into account under sentence. And one reason why you might want to have hate crime as a category is that you're trying to send an expressive signal. So one rationale for punishment is that it communicates a message from, the populace to everyone else to say this kind of thing is unacceptable. So targeting people out on the grounds of their race or their religion is an unacceptable thing, and we should be particularly worried about it, given various histories that we have. And so it has that expressive content when you make it a special kind of offense. You could take a view, which is that you'll call a thing a hate crime, but you'll punish it identically to the non-hate version of it, but that the labeling does some work. Now, obviously, there's another worry, which is that we're overly inclusive. So you have all these hoax hate crimes, either things that are totally made up. An odd one I read recently about an aide to a Republican lawmaker who appears to have colluded with a friend and someone else to stage an attack on her by cutting her flesh and beating her up and writing something like Trump's whore on her to create the impression that she was the victim of a hate crime against Republicans. And you have other versions of this.
This is the right wing Jesse Smollett.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
But I was thinking of cases like, this is really hideous, but you brought it up, the reparative or corrective rape or whatever. You could have somebody who thinks yeah, we need to help these poor lesbians and someone needs to go out and do this. It'll be, it's like a paternalism or something. Presumably, if we're going to punish bad speech at all, that would have to fall under that category. That would be a really grotesque thing to say, but it could conceivably not come from a place of hatred at all. Similarly, you might think that it would be not hateful to say, well, we should kidnap all the children of all the wrong religions and baptize them or forcibly convert them to the right religion for the sake of their eternal souls or something like that. There's no hatred involved there. So even the idea that I'm just not even convinced that there is this special category that's interestingly, carved up by hatred, because it seems like there are these other things that you could imagine people saying that seem like they ought to be in whatever is the morally significant category there.
So I think I want to draw a couple of distinctions. The one is speech immoral? And then the other one is, should we introduce a law to sanction the speech? And then what kind of law? Should it be criminal or should it be civil? And so you might think there's forms of speech that are immoral that we don't want to prohibit by the law. There's lots of conduct that's immoral that we don't prohibit by the law, like having an adulterous affair or eating meat, things like that. We think it's wrong, but we don't think that the law should get involved. And so you might think someone who says, well, all the Hindus worship a false faith and, we should go out and baptize them to the true faith, whatever that is. There's something immoral about that, but that we don't want to prohibit it. We definitely want to allow that sort of speech. But if you're like, Hindu people are Satan's spawn and we should expunge them from the face of the earth, now we've sort of met the hate speech thing. So we've said okay, we've said something about the group that makes them detestable, which is the hatred bit. And we're saying we should do something about it, which is extinguish them. Again, we can have general incitement categories. So, we don't always have to have hatred to restrict the speech. But for hate speech, it's sort of baked into the concept that there's this hate boiling over. So yeah, I think you've got to sort of think about a network of different kinds of speech acts that you want to either allow, even though they're immoral, some which you want to restrict in various different ways, and then thinking where they fall in sort of the different categories.
Well, Mark, I know you're are getting short on time here. Do you have any final thoughts or any final thing you want to bring up here?
Yeah, I think what's amazing about doing this kind of work is that it will always be in vogue. There's a huge clash in terms of sacred values that people have. On the one hand, you've got freedom, and on the other hand, you've got dignity, and we're often uncomfortable with how we draw the line between these two things. And I think especially as we have more polarization and more access to information, we sort of see things in the world on campuses or in the press or on social media where we feel some urge to go, I don't like that and I want it banned, or someone should do something about that. And maybe that is the right response on some occasions, and maybe it's not. And I think especially on the sort of in the campus cases, one of the things that I think is kind of important there is that if you're a public university and you're bound by something like the First Amendment, you should be very wary of restricting speech as a campus. You should maybe take the view, if what you've done is not protected speech, well, then the authorities should be able to do what they want and the law should take its course. But I worry about university administrators taking on the role of a court because I think they're not well placed for it. They're not trained judicial officers. They're not good triers of fact or appliers of legal principles. We'll also wind up in a situation where they'll be viewed as picking a side. So, they might go very lightly, for example, on anti-Israel protesters on campuses, which definitely happened for a long time, big Ivy Leagues, and then we'll be accused of going too heavy on them, at a later stage. So, there's an argument to say, look, we can have time, place, and manner restrictions. So, just because you have a right to, express your view on the war in Israel doesn't give you a right to go and occupy a classroom and prevent people from being able to have access to a public courtyard. Doesn't allow you to sort of shout down a speaker. None of those things are sort of, acceptable. But then what you have to do is actively ensure that that rule is applied equally. So, if you allow the pro-Gaza brigade to, occupy your campus for months and destroy people's private property rights and access rights and do nothing about it, well, that seems like you failed in your obligations. And if you applied them very vociferously against, let's say, the pro-Israel guys, well, then again, we have reason to think that you are doing something tainted.
I guess the thing I hear about that is like, well, these are just private organizations that no one's going to jail over this. Let them do what they want is kind of the response I expect to hear.
I think it does make a difference whether you're private or public, at least from a legal perspective. So if you're a private college, then you really can sort of set your rules differently. You can say, look, when you sign up, you know that you're entering into this kind of agreement. You might think that if they were to differentially enforce their neutral rules in ways that would be discriminatory and subject to sanction. But if they want to have rules that are more restrictive of speech, for example, then let's say they said, we're a Catholic school, and so, any of our lecturers who denounces the Pope, we're not going to tolerate that. You might think, well, okay, we understand why you have a rule like that. And obviously you couldn't have a rule like that at a public university, but you're a special Catholic place. So, the rule got a reason, and everybody signed up understanding that, and the First Amendment doesn't apply. But you might think that it's important to have a culture of free speech and that there's some moral reason to allow people to sort of, say things that are contestable and maybe even repugnant, that there might be some general moral principle that it's a good idea to even allow minor immorality for the greater good, because it's a good way to find out what's true. It's a good way to sort of, develop tolerance, those sorts of things.
Yeah, I think it was, in fact, the very first point I ever made on Brain on that was, a world where you've got all speech is legal, any kind of viewpoint is legal, but there are all sorts of incredibly intense social pressures not to say certain things might not even be better than a world with rampant censorship. So people stress, I think, overmuch the legal free speech versus what is socially sayable in like a private domain. I think that distinction gets overstressed.
Yeah, I think that's right. And Mill cautions against it. He says we must be worried about the tyranny of the majority. I was at a party in Memphis having a sort of interesting chat with someone who at some point apologized because he said, oh, I didn't mean to say anything offensive. And I said, you can say as much offensive stuff as you like around me because it's important. You need to be able to have some place where you can blow off steam. And the power of words is that they're just that often, that, if you need to have this little valve where you can say things that are salacious and ridiculous and over the top. Otherwise, if you suppress that stuff, it'll come out in other ways.
Well, you don't have to suppress yourself here on Micro-Digressions. Mark, it is always a pleasure to speak to you. Thanks so much for sharing your views and your expertise on these matters.
Absolute pleasure.